morning, everyone, and welcome to the Quentin Skinner Lecture and Colloquium for 2017. For this first in a new series of lectures, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Sophie Smith of the University of Oxford to address us on the subject of the nature of politics. Before I introduce her more fully, however, I would like to say a little bit about the nature of the present occasion. The Balzan-Skinner Lecture and Colloquium was originally established through the great generosity of Professor Quentin Skinner, following the award of his Balzan Prize for Achievement in Scholarship in the Humanities. He wanted to provide an early career scholar with an opportunity to spend a sabbatical term in Cambridge working on a project in modern intellectual history, involving as its highlight a lecture and a colloquium such as the one we shall enjoy today. The very generous funding supported 7 Balzan-Skinner Fellows, whom you find listed on your programme, from Hannah Dawson in 2010 to Teresa Bijan in 2016. They constitute an extremely distinguished list, and their lectures and attendant colloquia have significantly enriched the intellectual life of CRASSH, the History Faculty, and Polis, as well as the pages of the historical journal to which the lectures are submitted for publication. Since 2016, last year, the fellowship has been known as the Quentin Skinner Fellowship. And like the Balzan-Skinner Scholar, the Quentin Skinner Fellow holds a visiting fellowship at CRASSH for 1 term and presents the Quentin Skinner Lecture and its associated symposium. The new fellowship continues to be supported from the original funding from Professor Skinner, and we remain extraordinarily grateful to him for his initiative and his generosity, which is honoured in the title of the new fellowship and lecture. I now turn to introduce our fellow and lecturer for 2016-17, Dr. Sophie Smith. Dr. Smith will be well known to many members of this audience, as she was both an undergraduate and a graduate student at this university, before the award of a JRF at Christ Church, Oxford, and subsequently becoming Associate Professor of Political Theory in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Oxford. I myself have had the pleasure of knowing her from her undergraduate days, when, after 3 years of the then SPS tripos, she chose not to graduate, but instead to switch into history for a 1-year Part 2, taking a suite of History of Political Thought papers. She achieved the astonishing feat of beating almost all of the historians to come 5th in Part 2 history. After that, she took the MPhil in Political Thought and Intellectual History and subsequently went on to a PhD, both with equal distinction, being awarded the Quentin Skinner Prize for Best Performance on the MPhil and the Prince Consort Prize and Seeley Medal for Best PhD Dissertation in the History Faculty. Her research fellowship at Christ Church and her current appointment as Associate Professor show that she has impressed Oxford just as much as she's impressed us. In terms of research, Dr. Smith's work has always been characterised by her combined interest in modern political theory and in the history of political thought, a combination that has, of course, a very distinguished pedigree in Cambridge. Dr. Smith's PhD dissertation addressed that intersection through the tradition of political Aristotelianism, taking as her formal focus the figure of John Case, a late 16th century professor at Oxford, who published a semi-commentary on Aristotle's Politics in 1588. This work's puzzling and sometimes baffling mix of rigidity and innovation has proved resistant to interpretation. But Dr. Smith found an exceptionally fruitful way into its perplexities through concentrating on its conception of its own intellectual enterprise, that is, political science. Through the lens of what it is to do politics itself, substantive questions such as the nature of the city, of citizenship and subjecthood, of slavery and empire came into new and distinctive relief. In her subsequent projects and publications, Dr. Smith has, in part, been extending these exciting lines of inquiry in an historical sweep from Aristotle himself to Thomas Hobbes. But she has always had broader interests in political theory, including themes such as gender and the environment. In 2012, she co-organised with Katrina Forrester a major conference on the latter, which has led to a co-edited volume entitled Nature, Action and the Future, Political Thought and the Environment, which will shortly be forthcoming with Cambridge University Press. In addition to all of this, she has always been distinctively interested in literature, an interest which is involved during questions of the poetics of political science, the written form of which centrally concerned early modern writers and really ought to concern us more too. For all these reasons, it's a very great pleasure to have Dr. Smith here on this remarkable political morning to talk about the nature of politics. Just a quick word about form before we begin. Dr. Smith will lecture for roughly an hour, at which point I shall open the floor to questions before we break for lunch at 1 o'clock. So please join me now in welcoming Dr. Smith today.
Well, thank you, Annabelle, so much for that really lovely introduction. And thanks to Michelle, wherever she is, for all that she did to organise today. And of course to Melissa, to Richard, to Noah and Emma for so kindly agreeing to be involved. To the electors to this fellowship who gave me this opportunity to think through some new research along some of the themes that Annabelle mentioned and to present it to you. And indeed to my colleagues in Oxford who gave me the time away to take it. It's always a pleasure to be back in Cambridge, but today is particularly special on so many levels. Now, not only for me, because there are so many friends in the audience. I know most of you have been up all night, and I truly am very grateful to you for making it. But also because I suspect that this is the only time in my academic career when I'll have the opportunity to give a lecture in front of every single one of the undergraduate teachers to whom I owe truly unpayable debts. So to Richard Sargentson, to Melissa, very briefly, to John Dunn, of course to Annabelle, who also saw me through the PhD, and to Quentin Skinner, whose extraordinary generosity, as Annabelle pointed out, is the reason that this lecture series exists at all, and if I may say so, whose commitment actually to doing something about what was once an abysmal gender imbalance in our discipline is reflected not only in the lineup today, but in the fact that, so far at least, the majority of speakers in this series that takes his name have been female scholars at the start of their careers. Now I should mention that this is also the first time that I'll give a lecture in front of my mother. The first time I read aloud to my mother, she admonished me quite sternly for doing so with insufficient oomph, as she put it. So I'd just like to say I'm going to do my best today not to disappoint on all fronts. Right, well, I'd like to talk to you today, as Annabelle has said, about the study of politics. That is, on the one hand, what people take themselves to be investigating when they claim to study politics. What does one do or think about when one studies politics? And what is it that you need to know? What a question to set myself up to ask today. But on the other hand, why do people study politics? To what end? These are questions, I think, that receive new prominence in 16th century Europe, and particularly in 16th century England. And today I'm going to focus on the English case. So let me begin with a few observations about civil science or civil philosophy, both acceptable and available translations of scientia civilis or scientia politica, as a backdrop to the story that I want to tell today. The absolutely standard way of classifying civil science in medieval and Renaissance Europe was as one part of a tripartite division of moral philosophy that tracked Aristotle's ethics, economics, and politics. Now, within this framework, politics and oikonomics, as it was called, were often treated as the practical dimension of moral philosophy, right? The treatment of how general moral rules, say, might be applied to an individual's actions in the household and in the city. And I think it's fair to say that within this model, politics didn't have too much of an independent standing. So it's striking that in the mid-16th century, civil science as a discipline gains new prominence. Now, Emma's going to tell us a little more about this in the French case this afternoon. Let me say a few words about the English case. Whereas, for example, Aristotle's Politics had been on the arts curriculum in both Oxford and Cambridge from the 14th century onwards, in the mid-16th century, we see at both places new statutory requirements that it be expounded by a university lecturer in philosophy. Indeed, in Cambridge, ever the more scholarly place, the requirement in the 1558 and 1570 statutes prescribed that the university lecturer in philosophy gave these lectures in Greek. And furthermore, and I think more importantly, we begin to see men appointed to lecture specifically on what was called scientia politica. So in Oxford, this is true in Merton, for example, and in Christchurch. In 1581, Richard Hakluyt was appointed to teach civil science. And we see a no doubt related emergence of debates about the status of civil science, by which I mean both its status in the academy and its status as a science, that is, the epistemic status of its premises and its conclusions. Indeed, as Richard Tuck noticed many years ago in a throwaway remark in Natural Rights Theories, the term political scientist, he says, came into vogue in the later part of the 16th century. He doesn't say so, he can tell us himself, but I take it that this is Richard's translation of the word politicus, and I think it's a fair one. It signals something distinctive about how the term was used in this period. That is to say, we find the word politicus used in a new way, for it was not simply the word that was meant to refer to, say, a ruler ruling in the interests of the people, the translation of the Greek politikos, nor was it, as we are so often told, simply the word for the Machiavellian reason of state-mongering politician, right? We see the emergence of the politicus as the student of politics, or, in the words of Thomas Thomas's widely used Latin-English dictionary of 1587, he that hath good understanding of the commonwealth. This suggests that politics is not merely something one might go out and do, but something one might try to understand. There's certainly a big question as to why these developments occurred. That is, why this sudden interest in understanding politics, in teaching politics, in thinking about politics as a discipline. But what I want to do here is look at what early modern writers thought you needed to understand. In what did civil science, as opposed to, say, traditional moral philosophy or ethics, consist? Now, of course, this is a huge question with a great many answers. But we might say that insofar as this question has been addressed by scholars, the answers, broadly speaking, fall into three categories: Cicero, Machiavelli, history. The Ciceronian view is the one that Quentin has taught us so much about. We might call it the rhetorical view, wherein civil science was the preserve of the orator, right? It doesn't seem to have too much propositional content of its own. It consists primarily in learning the rules laid out by the Roman rhetoricians. And on this account, when one thinks about civil science, one thinks not about, to put it one way, the demonstration and teaching of truth, but about knowing how to win an audience's belief. Scholars have also noticed that Machiavelli, particularly Machiavelli of the Discourses, was viewed as a source specifically for civil science, for what English courtiers came to call politiques. In many such writers, we get the sense that there is a new energy around thinking about politics, and Machiavelli was, by some, taken to represent it. Finally, scholars, particularly historians, no surprise here, have emphasised the association that many in the late 16th century did make between civil science and the study of history. And of course, very often this penchant for history overlapped directly with this move to Machiavelli. So we find, for example, in Francis Bacon, the remark that the histories of times afford the best matter for discourses upon politics, such as those of Machiavel. There's something all three of these early modern ways of thinking about civil science have in common, and that's a prudential emphasis, right? Each recognise the political as an arena in flux, an unstable sphere subject to fortune, something about which we can never be certain how right they were, and so not something that we might ever subject to science or to philosophy, properly speaking. They also, and no doubt relatedly, share an emphasis on the virtue of the individual, and so on the question of how must the man of action behave in a tempestuous political sphere. But there was another way of thinking about politics in the 16th century, and it was different, and it was one developed by readers of Aristotle's Politics. What these readers took seriously, right from the earliest commentaries on the Politics in 1265, was Aristotle's claim that what he was writing was political science, politicae episteme. A key distinction here is between speculation and action. Right? Aristotle had pointed out that some disciplines were speculative and some were practical. And this distinction tracked a claim about the certainty of the knowledge that could be expected. So speculative disciplines aim at truth, practical ones at probable knowledge. Where Aristotle seems to have equivocated on how politics, concerned as it was with human action, could count as a science on its own terms, his medieval and Renaissance readers determined to take him seriously and to ask how a discipline could be concerned with the contingencies of action and yet also meet the Aristotelian criteria for a science. There were many things that the various commentators on this issue differed on, but almost all of them agreed that the object of political science, the primary thing the political scientist treats, is not the virtue of the citizen, but the nature of the city itself. In trying to work out how the city, the civitas, might be the object of speculative science, many 16th century commentators, following prompts in Book 1 of the Politics, suggested that civil philosophy was much like natural philosophy, where the former treats civil bodies just like the latter treats natural bodies. And so, they argued, the methods Aristotle outlined for natural philosophy were also appropriate for thinking about the civitas. You dissolve it into its smallest parts in order to show in what they consist, and then to give a causal account of how they emerge. And, to say in the words of Louis Leroy's English translator, to what ends they are ordained. But notice that this move involves a naturalization of the civitas, and so too a naturalization of political science. We've lost that practical dimension of political science, the sense perhaps that the city isn't merely natural, but something that men themselves might make. And there is another account, however, in the Politics of the City, in Book 3, and this elicited another account of the object of political science. In Book 3, Aristotle tells us, the city is a multitude of citizens placed in some kind of order, taxis, and that in every constitution, the word in Greek here is politeia, the citizen body, the politeuma, is the sovereign or highest power. Now, anyone who has looked into this, as both Melissa and Annabel know that Aristotle's own account of this relationship between civitas, politeia, and politeuma is highly complex, and so too were the commentators' responses to it. But for our purposes, and this is actually drawing on a point that Annabel first made, I think it's fair to say that many Aristotelian authors thought that political science doesn't really get going until Book 3 of the Politics, right? Because political science was the science of the form of the civitas, that is, the politeia, which in Latin was often rendered either as res publica or as status. In English, the commonwealth or the state. That is to say, in the Aristotelian tradition, we have, on the one hand, the thought that the object of political science is this natural civitas, which can be investigated with the tools of natural philosophy. And on the other hand, we have this suggestion that real political inquiry takes as its proper object the man-made form of the civitas, the order or framework of offices. And I suppose, and here I'm doing some inferential work, it's scientific in that it explains the formal relationships between these parts. To anticipate, Hobbes too, right, will take up the idea that political science is at least in part the study of the form of the commonwealth, whilst jettisoning absolutely anything like a natural civitas. I'd just like to point out that this second view did not remain isolated in the Aristotelian commentaries. In Edward Fawcett's 1606, a comparative discourse of the body's natural and politique, a text, by the way, on Hobbes's list of books in the Hardwicke Library, Fawcett, as far as I can tell, coined the English phrase politique philosopher. And Fawcett says that this figure has for his proper subject the compound of men civilly assembled and associate, that is, the body politic, or the form of a commonweal. Now, given my focus on the English context, it's particularly lucky for us that one of the most interesting Aristotelian contributions, Annabelle preempted me here, to the debate about the nature of political science was that of the Oxford philosopher John Case. The relevant text here is Case's Sphæra Civitatis, The Sphere of the City of 1588, a book taught on the arts course at Oxford well into the 17th century, from which exam questions for students were directly taken, and yet another book on Hobbes's list of books in the Hardwicke Library. At the very start of the Sphæra, Case announces that he's treating civil science as a philosopher, not as an orator. And, far more directly than any other Aristotelian author, he takes on the problem of what he calls scientia politica, political science. He agrees with the Aristotelians that primarily the ultimate object of political science is the city, but where other authors, he notes, have asked whether it's either practical or speculative, he implies that it's both. Now, he knew that this claim was one that might come under scrutiny, and we know that he knew this because this is precisely the objection, this is the point to which he has his objector, the person deployed in the text to raise obvious problems with his argument. He has this objector reject this claim. So drawing on the Nicomachean Ethics and on the posterior Analytics, the objector argues that there can be no science of the civitas, because, with Aristotle, every object of a science should be necessary and eternal. The Commonwealth, however, is subject to failure and chance. Nations and empires devastated by war, cities altered by their constitutions. This all proves, the objector says, the mutability and transitory nature of civitates. It's worth quoting Case's response in full. Two things, he tells us, are considered in political science: the demonstration of theorem and the action of citizens. With respect to the demonstration of theorem, he says, the civitas is something necessary, eternal, immutable. It's certainly the case that the empires of the Persians, the Macedonians, the Romans have fallen, but nonetheless, the universal and formal commonwealth under the demonstration of this science remains. What is Case up to here when he says that political science demonstrates, as he puts it elsewhere, with exactitude the properties and powers of the city? Well, the first thing we need to note in answering this is Case often slides between two accounts of precisely what the political philosopher does, right? What's going on here? On the one hand, he says, as I've just pointed out, that they demonstrate with exactitude the powers, laws, properties, and all other things which pertain to all commonwealths. Right? But on the other hand, when elaborating what this means, he'll suggest that the task of the philosopher in this regard is to provide an account of the best, or the ideal commonwealth, which, he points out, is something that might never been and might never be. Where the formal task involves articulating a set of, the former task, but also possibly also the formal task, involves articulating a set of attributes that all or nearly all commonwealths share, what contemporary political philosophers would call the necessary and sufficient conditions for a commonwealth. The latter task, that of specifying an ideal commonwealth, involves listing attributes not present in every commonwealth. Thus we see the distinction between description and prescription begin to blur. Now, one way of thinking through Case's slide is to notice that he moves between wanting what we might call the sort of scientific dimension of political philosophy and what I'm going to call the poetic dimension of political philosophy. On the one hand, Case wants to tell us, with Aristotle of the posterior Analytics and the physics, that the task of political philosophy is to demonstrate the essential properties of cities and to give an account of their causes. But on the other hand, he suggests, in a seemingly Platonic vein, that the political philosopher should offer us an ideal model of the commonwealth. Now, we shouldn't be surprised by the Platonic resonance here, Many Renaissance Aristotelians set themselves the task of showing how Plato and Aristotle could be resolved. And this includes, importantly, Louis Leroy, whose own French translation and commentary was translated into the very first and extraordinarily popular English language edition of the Politics in 1598. So Leroy, in his preface, speaks of his commitment to, as he puts it, join Plato and Aristotle together. And he also opens his edition of the Politics, telling readers that Plato in general provided certain universal forms, shapes, patterns of all natural and artificial things, which he terms idea. And when he turned to the Commonwealth, Plato did cast in his imagination a certain idea of a perfect Commonwealth, and rather divine than human. So it's interesting that this is exactly how Case describes Aristotle's project in Book 7 of the Politics. What Aristotle calls the polis of our prayers. Case says, "Now I come to Plato's idea and More's utopia. For in this book, Aristotle delineates a utopia and a divine idea and form of the Commonwealth, which no multitude of men at any time have ever encountered." Many commentators had referred to Book 7 of the Politics as an exercise in speaking de optima republica, on the sort of best Commonwealth, the best state of the Commonwealth. But Case is the first I've read to use the word utopia and to connect it to what Plato was up to in the Republic. So we see Case suggest that one aspect of political science might be to cast the perfect form of the Commonwealth in the imagination. Indeed, we find him defending his own account in precisely these terms, and once again his objector is revelatory for us here. "It is a work of fable," the objector says, "to figure cities in the air with Lucian, ideas in the mind with Plato, utopias with More, and other such fictions of this kind. Therefore," he goes on, "it is idle to describe a model form of the Republic, because this model form is nothing else than the mere fancy of the philosopher. For nothing that exists matches such a description." Now, Case really doesn't like that the objector makes Lucian an example of the kind of fictional commonwealth he's defending, and he rejects this outright. But, he says, he does follow Plato, More, and Aristotle when they philosophize, when they speak as philosophers about the best republic. Because, he says, although they describe invisible commonwealths, these descriptions are not useless. The rejection of Lucian here is important. Lucian, translated into Latin by Erasmus and Thomas More, had written in his Vera Historia of men who land on the moon and turn their sweat from milk to cheese. Case isn't interested in mere castles in the air, and he wants to distinguish the fictions of the philosophers from them. It's worth noting, and I really can't do more than gesture at this in the time we have, that I think Case here is speaking to a debate about the proper relationship between philosophy and the city, and specifically about whether there is any use for philosophers' accounts of imaginary commonwealths that was going on in the 16th century. And the question was whether or not it was better to do this kind of thing, this philosophical, imaginative kind of thing, or whether it was best to think about the best commonwealth, either via history or via a kind of comparison of existing constitutions, as Aristotle was reported to have achieved. We see the worry behind Case's objector's complaint that imaginary commonwealths are futile, expressed in Cicero's De Oratore, but it's also there in Baudin's Methodus, in the preface to the 1587 English translation of François Delannoe's highly popular Politique and Military Discourses, and perhaps more proximately for Case, Sir Thomas Smith, indeed, so many Thomases, Sir Thomas Smith closes his De Republica Anglorum, first printed in 1583. It really is that good. He closes it in terms that closely resemble those of Case's objector. Now, Case's defence of such idealised accounts of the Commonwealth consists in the insistence that such commonwealths are not necessarily invisible, but contingently so. Right? It's men who fail to activate their lessons. Because Case insists that political philosophy is practical and purposive, it has, he says, an end in securing peace, security, and prosperity. So he is committed to the claim that idealized commonwealths have to be useful, and political philosophers have to be concerned, to use a modern phrase, with implementation. So I'd like to suggest Case is trying to hold together two different kinds of account of the Commonwealth: a descriptive scientific account and a prescriptive imaginative account. And moreover, he insists that these accounts together must have practical effects. At the end of his book, he uses a piece of language that we might think well hints at this marriage of parts, when he tells us that what he, the political philosopher, has provided is a theoricus civitatis globus, a theoric globe of the city. Now, the specific term theoric here suggests that which is the result of abstract contemplation. But a theoric is also associated quite specifically with the imagination. A theoric gives you a view of something. It allows you to picture something. Here, the association with the Greek theoria as both speculation and a sight or spectacle really comes through. Theorics were also associated in our period with a level of certainty. In geometry, theorics signified abstract mathematical rules and definitions which were distinct from the practical applications to which geometry could be put. The term theoric was also in wide use in astronomy and in cosmography, where it was used to designate any set of laws that governed some aspect of the natural world. But crucially too, a theoric could be a kind of guide, like an armillary sphere, which provided a planispheric projection of the heavens, modelling the motions of the planets, and from which you could teach geometry and make calculations you could teach astronomy and make calculations in geometry. So, a theoric globe of the city here is a model which we can use to guide our actions when constituting and navigating cities ourselves, and it represents a bridge between theory and practice. Now, Case is the first author I've seen in the Aristotelian tradition anyway to use the specific language of theory to discuss the nature of the city. And the thought that the theoretical dimension to political inquiry consists in delineating an ideal commonwealth became only more firmly established in 17th century political thought. Now, to summarise, Case thinks that a political science must be both descriptive and prescriptive, an exercise of both our scientific and imaginative capacities, and moreover, be practically oriented. Thus already, in the emerging idea of a theory of politics, if you like, we have a tension between considering things as they actually are and considering things as they ought to be. And yet Case does not give us much by way of detail of how such a political science, both descriptive and prescriptive, scientific and imaginative, theoretical and prudential, is supposed to work. It's a vision, but it's a hazy one. Now, much has been written about how the study of politics might be assimilated to the study of science. Well, not actually that much, but Noah has written an awful lot about it, to whom I'm deeply indebted. But of course, an awful lot has been written about how the study of politics might be assimilated to the study of science in Hobbes, and I'm going to turn to Hobbes later. But for now, I want to think just a little more about what it might mean for the study of politics to be imaginative, poetic, and how that elucidates the idea of a form of inquiry that is at once theoretical and practical. We find a meditation on exactly this question in a near contemporary English text written by a man in Case's extended milieu, and that is Philip Sidney's Defence of Poesy, first written in 1583, first published in 1595. As is clear from his title, Sidney thought poetry must be defended, not least from Puritan critics, and one way he went about doing this was by offering a new conception of what poetry done right could achieve. Now, one route that Sidney pursued was familiar to Renaissance poetics. He argues that poetry can move men to act on the conclusions of moral philosophy. Where philosophers truck, as he puts it, in mere wordish descriptions, the right poet will yield to the powers of the mind an image which strikes, pierces and possesses the soul the sight of the soul, that's the phrase he uses. In this vein, Sidney calls the poet the right popular philosopher, precisely because he can make, even to those minds resistant to philosophy, he can make them adopt and act on its precepts. But poetry for Sidney was not merely a handmaiden to philosophy. It could do something more. With other theorists of poetry, and indeed with Socrates of the Symposium, Sidney points to the etymology of the word poet in the Greek, poiein. I've never pronounced that out loud before. There are lots of Greek speakers in the audience who no doubt correct me. But the point is, he points to the etymology to show that poets are makers, or artificers. Where the whole scheme of human knowledge, Sidney says, the trivium and quadrivium, plus natural and moral philosophy, law, history, medicine, metaphysics, and he really goes as far as metaphysics, all these really do is merely represent nature, all depend on what nature sets forth. Only the poet, he says, escapes any such subjection. With the vigour of his own invention, he in effect grows another nature. Poets do not act as makers simply by improving nature, but, Sidney says, by bringing forth, quite anew, forms such as never were in nature. Where nature's world is brazen, says Sidney, the poets can deliver a golden. And Sidney really means deliver here. He insists that this, and now I'm quoting, delivering forth is not wholly imaginative, as we are wont to say by them that build castles in the air, but so far substantially it worketh, not only to make a new, excellent, virtuous form, but to bestow that form upon the world. The example, maybe tellingly, he gives is of Xenophon's fictional prince, Cyrus. Where nature, Sidney says, could have perhaps given us, a single Cyrus, a particular king, the poet bestows a Cyrus upon the world to make many Cyruses, if they will learn aright why and how that maker made him. Notice Sidney too is keen to suggest that he's not talking about mere castles in the air, not something destined to remain merely in our fancy. Indeed, where Shakespeare's Theseus in A Midsummer Night's Dream would argue that precisely because, in his words, imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, we should be suspicious of poets and fables. Sidney insists that we should distinguish between poetry that is eikastike, figures forth good things with a good end in mind, and poetry that is fantastike, which infects the fancy with unworthy objects. The capacity of the right poet to figure forth forms is not unconstrained or deployed willy-nilly. It has to have some good end. Now, Sidney tells us that when a poet acts in such a way, he is like God, bringing things forth with the force of divine breath. George Putnam, another contemporary poetic theorist, and one perhaps influenced by the circulating manuscript of Sidney's texts, puts the point really succinctly in his 1589, The Art of English Poesy. The poet is a maker, such as we may say of God, who made the world of naught. That is, who made the world ex nihilo. One example Sidney gives us of such newly patterned forms, as he puts it, are commonwealths. He gives More's Utopia as an example. Viewed as he has presented it, Sidney argues, it is poetry that truly deserves the title of the architectonic science. That is, Sidney tells us knowingly that poetry sits in the place Aristotle reserved for political science. And I say knowingly because Sidney wrote a letter to his friend Fulk Greville in which he said, I'm learning Greek purely so I can read Aristotle's Politics in the original. Sidney thinks this because it is poetry that can do what neither moral philosophy, traditionally conceived, nor indeed history can. Not only can poetry move people to adopt and act on the precepts of moral philosophy, it can, moreover, bring into existence new ideas for the benefit of mankind. On both these views, what poetry does, and this is what Sidney is really getting at, I think, by naming it the true architectonic science, is provide a bridge between theory and practice. I want now, finally, almost by contractual obligation, to turn to Hobbes. Because Hobbes is an author in whom I see this confluence of things we've seen associated with thinking about politics in the late Elizabethan period. That concern with the form of the city and with what it means to demonstrate that form, but also with the relationship between philosophy and poetry. In 1649 to 1650, whilst Hobbes was in exile in Paris, he did two things every day. The first we all, of course, know about, the writing of Leviathan, in which he was completely engrossed. The second is less widely known. He read, perhaps not in this room, in most rooms, he read and he commented upon his friend and fellow exile, William Davenant's heroic poem, Gondibert. The poem itself was dedicated to Hobbes, and in the dedication, Davenant thanks the philosopher for giving his verse daily examination. So engaged with Davenant's work was Hobbes that he wrote his own preface to the poem in response to Davenant's dedication. In that preface, Hobbes offers us what is now a familiar line on the relationship of poetry to philosophy. He tells us that so far forth as the fancy of man, that is, the poet's good wit, their capacity to body forth novel forms, to seek unusual resemblances between different things, so far forth as fancy has traced the ways of true philosophy, so far it has produced very marvellous effects to the benefit of mankind. And by the way of example, in this response to Davenant, Hobbes gives us almost to the word the list of things that in chapter 13 he would come to tell us can't emerge in the state of nature: navigation, commodious building, instruments of motion, and so on. Hobbes adds to this the further familiar points, familiar not just from Sidney, but at this point from Francis Bacon, that good poems can either instruct those who find philosophy impenetrable, or they can actually inspire an appetite for knowledge. Remember how important curiosity is for Hobbes. This is a big claim. That is, poetry either explains philosophy or it gets people interested in it. So here we have the poetry as handmaiden to philosophy line. But Hobbes also briefly, tantalizingly, says something else about the relationship of philosophy to poetry, of fancy and philosophy. There are some instances, he tells us, where the precepts of true philosophy fail. There, the architect, fancy, must take the philosopher's part upon herself. Now, it's not immediately clear what Hobbes is saying here. The key word surely is architect, because by architect, Hobbes's readers would have understood not only the person who patterns, models, and frames buildings, but also the demiurge of Plato's Timaeus, Christ, the architect of the church, and God, the divine architect of nature, who created the world from nothing. Hobbes here seems to leave a space open for the poet, notably the poet well-versed in philosophy, someone with what Hobbes might call exceptional judgment, who is something like Sidney's poet, a poet who conjures ex nihilo new forms with a good end in mind. So, does Hobbes think either of these conceptions of poetry have any place in thinking about politics? Well, it's clear that he certainly utilizes poetry as handmaiden to philosophy, right? Notice that where Hobbes might change his mind, as he surely does, on the use of oratory, he's pretty consistent on poetry. He cites Medea in the Elements, De Cive, and Leviathan, notably to evidence his claim about the very dangers of rhetoric. And we might also say, and this is a can of worms I'm going to open now and we can have a look at in the questions, we might also say that the condition of mere nature is another example, a poetic device that gives us another means of coming to know than that by which philosophy can demonstrate. But what about fancy or poetry as an architect rather than as a mere handmaiden? Taking the philosopher's part upon herself. Is there any room for this in Hobbes's politics? Our instinctive answer is surely no, right? Because if we know anything about Hobbes, we know that he insists that his civil philosophy was truly a science. And even though, as Noel Malcolm has shown, Hobbes does change his mind on precisely what he takes to be the criteria for proper science, he does consistently assert that his civil philosophy is such a science, because it demonstrates universal truths from fixed definitions, because it expresses the necessary connection between conceptual entities that make up the body politic. However, I think that there is a puzzle right at the heart of Hobbes's civil philosophy. And it's a puzzle that might suggest a place for poetry, not as handmaiden to philosophy, but as architect. The puzzle concerns the very nature and identity of Hobbes's Commonwealth. And for this, we need to look at his various accounts of the genesis of the state. I'm going to stick with the account of the Commonwealth by institution here. So, in every version of his political theory, we find Hobbes posit a multitude of sufficient size that come together, and, because of men's natural character, we see that peace requires there be, as he puts it in De Cive, a single will among all of them. We achieve a single will, Hobbes tells us, in both the Elements and in De Cive, by choosing a single other, an individual or group, whose will we will take as our own. We do this by making a pact each with each, to subject our will to this other, such that the decisions they make are taken of the will of all and each. This, then, I take it, is the process by which the multitude appoints a sovereign. But in both the Elements and De Cive, Hobbes doesn't think that this is the whole picture by any means. He wants something more. Continuing with De Cive, he goes on, a union so made is called a commonwealth, a civitas, or civil society, and also a civil person, persona civilis. For since there is one will of them all, it is to be taken as one person. Every civitas, he says immediately afterwards, is a civil person. What does Hobbes mean here? On the one hand, everything he says could in fact be parsed out such that the commonwealth, the person, is just another way of talking about the sovereign, right? He says no one bar the sovereign is to be regarded as the commonwealth. Or are we meant to think that the civil person in question is a new entity? If so, how did it emerge? What explains its connection with the sovereign? These questions are not answered by Hobbes's definition of the sovereign in De Cive as merely the man or assembly to whose will each individual has subjected their will. And yet, this account, Hobbes says, has satisfactorily shown, in the desire for their own conservation, a number of natural persons have coalesced into one civil person, which we call a commonwealth. Note the word coalesced here. The Latin is a little weird. It sort of suggests to swell or to increase. And notice, too, that we have a very thin account of the relationship of the sovereign to the commonwealth. The sovereign can be regarded as the commonwealth. The thicker, clearer relationship is between multitude and sovereign. Note, I'm not saying there's any covenant between those two entities. I'm saying there's a relationship established. Not because, for this reason, but because they have taken the sovereign's will as their own. Now, in Leviathan, Hobbes introduces his much-discussed theory of persons, though notably one that yields no obvious classification for the state, right? It takes, as David Runciman has shown us, quite some exegetical imagination to suggest that the state is a person by fiction. As for the genesis of the Commonwealth, we have, on one level, a similar account. Again, to achieve their end, the multitude must, he says, confer all their power and strength upon one man or assembly, that may reduce their plural wills to one will. This time, however, Hobbes says, that is as much to say, to appoint one man or assembly of men to bear their person. Now, at this point, we might again think that armed with his new theory of persons, Hobbes is simply saying that each man agrees with each to take, individually agrees with each, to take the same representative. So that when Hobbes speaks of appointing a man to bear their person, he doesn't mean, of course, any pre-existing person of the multitude. He means bear each and every one of their natural persons. And I think this sort of interpretation is endorsed by his statement in chapter 15. That is chapter 16, excuse me, that is the chapter on persons, authors, and things personated, that every man gives their common representer authority from himself in particular. The multitude here are not ontologically speaking one person, we know that. They're called one person insofar as they share an artificial person. That is, they share a representative. But this sits somewhat unhappily with the other statement Hobbes makes in chapter 16, to the effect that the multitude, and this is the language he uses, are made one person when they are by one man or one person represented. This is surely transformative language, and Hobbes seems again to want to suggest there's a new third entity here, not multitude, not sovereign, but person, commonwealth, civitas. And this is only emphasised in chapter 17 of Leviathan, when he first defines the commonwealth. Covenanting done, he says, the multitude so united in one person is called a commonwealth, in Latin civitas. This generation of that great Leviathan, or rather, to speak more reverently, of that mortal God, to whom we owe under the immortal God our peace and defence. The commonwealth, to define it, is one person. So do we have a new entity here? It sounds like it. It's been named anew. Hobbes is very clear about his concern with naming distinct entities. But then Hobbes also says of his commonwealth, for by this authority given to him, the commonwealth, by every particular man, he, the commonwealth, hath use of so much power and strength conferred upon him. So again, we seem to move back to the thought that the multitude is that the commonwealth is the sovereign, because the only him to whom authority has been given by every particular man is the sovereign. And yet, when Hobbes comes to define the sovereign, he says, and he that carrieth this person is called sovereign. So again, it's clear. Hobbes does seem to want some third entity, the state, to emerge from the covenant. But it's not always clear on his own terms that it does, how it does. And the introduction, I'd just like to say, of the language of authorization in Leviathan doesn't help us to get clear on the nature and emergence of the state. It only affects how we speak, I think, about the relationship between the sovereign and the subject, where, the former is the actor and the latter the author of all their actions. Note, too, that in subsequent chapters of Leviathan, Hobbes speaks of the sovereign as she who bears the person of them all. Again, we have that ambiguity. We might think then that when Hobbes spoke earlier of the multitude appointing a man to bear their person, he did not in fact mean their individually, each of their individual natural persons. He meant instead the person of them all taken together. But this formulation would be more obviously problematic, right? Hobbes would be saying that the sovereign is appointed to bear a person, whilst also saying, because he denies any unity outside of the covenant, that such a person cannot exist until it is borne by the sovereign. So how should we think about all of this? Well, notice that there are two stories here. This is what I wish to suggest. The first is what we might call the minimal analytic account, which tells us how the multitude all individually appoint the same person or group as their representative. That is, she whose will they take as their own. That is what the covenant seems to get you. And on this account, surely the state is the sovereign. But of course, this story fails to make sense of what's going on when Hobbes goes to such lengths to tell us that a commonwealth is something distinct from the sovereign. I mean, that's clearly what he's reaching for. It's not clear that a purely analytic account can get us this. And an account without this misses the spirit of what Hobbes is trying to do. And the reason, of course, he's trying to do this, the reason he wants some kind of distinction between multitude, sovereign, and state, the abstract seat of power, as he calls it, is not only with a concern for stability over time, but also for important psychological reasons. You need something more than a magisterial representative. You need something to keep people in sufficient awe that they keep their covenants and remain safe from nature. So we have a second, ontologically richer account, whereby a civil person or a mortal god emerges from a multitude where it didn't previously exist. Notice that due to Hobbes's desire to avoid parliamentarian lines of argument, this must be achieved, right, as I've said, without any appeal to a unity that appoints the sovereign to represent it, to stand for it, to animate it. Hobbes wants both of these things at once. But how can he have them? This, I think, is where the real problem lies for Hobbes. He states that, rather than explains how this civil person, or indeed mortal god, artificial man, Leviathan, comes about from the fact that each individual member of the multitude has taken on the same will, they've covenanted to take on the same will. I think the fundamental question here might be not what kind of person is the state, but how the state, the civil person, emerges as an entity distinct from the sovereign. Whichever way you look at it, something spooky is going on here. Now, if we return to the passage we just looked at in chapter 17 of Leviathan, that is the one where Hobbes comes to do this work of telling us about the emergence of the Commonwealth as a distinct entity, let's concede him that, rather than explaining how it happens, we notice that there's a transition into a poetic register. It is here that we get the state described as a Leviathan or a mortal god. Now, one way of reading this is to think that here we see poetry helping us on our way to true philosophy. Hobbes is using poetry to help us see this metaphysically complicated thing. But another reading, is that what we're seeing here is fancy, the architect, taking on philosophy's part upon herself. So what do I mean by this? Well, perhaps there just is no philosophical account of why it is that covenanting each with each produces a mortal god or a commonwealth who is born and animated by the sovereign. Think about the introduction to Leviathan, another moment where, in describing the genesis of the state, Hobbes again reaches for poetic language. The state is both a Leviathan and an artificial man, and Hobbes speaks of the pacts and covenants that set it together as resembling that fiat, or let us make man, pronounced by God in the creation. This is not the first time that Hobbes had compared the creation of the Commonwealth to God's creation of the world. In the Elements, he tells us that both commonwealths by institution and those by compulsion are like creations out of nothing. This is the Anglicization of the Latin phrase ex nihilo. And that which is ex nihilo, Hobbes argues elsewhere, is incomprehensible by philosophy, a divine mystery. But we know from Philip Sidney the name of the human artificer who conjures forms as if ex nihilo in the service of the good of mankind. And that is, of course, the poet. And here, perhaps, Hobbes, the poet-philosopher, as John Dryden once called him, sees that to bring a non-existing thing into being, poetry must step in. Philosophy has taken us so far, but it cannot bring Leviathan into existence. Indeed, the covenant will only bring forth the Leviathan if those covenanting have been impressed by Hobbes's fanciful imaging, and so make this happen themselves. So it's not so much that Hobbes is describing what happens when the multitude covenants each with each, but that Hobbes himself is making it the case that so covenanting, a Leviathan will emerge. Notice that the fact that people did not in fact covenant does not matter here. It's sufficient for Hobbes that people think, I would covenant, and so doing, a Leviathan would emerge. That is to say, then, that Hobbes in his texts is perhaps trying himself to bring the state into being, and whether or not he's successful depends on whether or not people are convinced of its existence, and so come to believe in it. If he is successful, if Leviathan is indeed taken up in the universities, people are convinced that this real or hypothetical act of commenting would create the Leviathan, then the Leviathan exists. This might be the sort of thought behind Hobbes's swiftly abandoned claim in the Elements that the body politic is a fictitious body. It is the conception raised by the word body politic, something that exists in our fancies. But note, to say that something exists in fancy is not necessarily to say that it doesn't have a real material existence and thus real material effects. As we know, for Hobbes, images well imprinted upon us can, as he put it to Davenant, stay in our fancies forever, can govern all of our thoughts and affections, and so, surely I can infer, can have significant effects on how we act. If this interpretation is right, then Hobbes can also be read as offering us a striking answer to the question of how a seemingly utopian description of an ideal commonwealth can at once be theoretical and practical. By practical, I don't here mean merely the sense of being a guide for the sovereign or something to be taught in the universities. I mean practical in the sense in which Hobbes himself is trying to create something ex nihilo. Thus, Hobbes gives us one answer to how tracing an ideal commonwealth can be both a practical and a theoretical enterprise. This brings us to the final point of my lecture today. We've seen that in these early modern English texts, as the distinction between theory and practice emerged in thinking specifically about politics, which, for many of these writers, meant thinking about the form of the city. The theoretical side of politics, the philosophical aspect, if you like, was sometimes considered to consist in delineating an ideal commonwealth. And so, too, we see in early modernity worries about the whole point of doing that, about how such an enterprise might be related to actual practice, and therefore so too about how political theory, as I think we now really can call it, might avoid being merely castles in the air. These are not worries that have gone away. Here, the move to Oxford becomes apparent, because there are two familiar critiques, contemporary critiques of ideal theory. The more familiar is that the problem with ideal theory is that it's not sufficiently constrained, right? So people propose utopian solutions which don't recognize, say, basic facts of human psychology, right? This is the point early modern authors, I take it, were making against solution. We're not going to go and make our sweat into cheese or what have you. But there's a second, less familiar critique, made more forcefully by Charles Mills, which argues that even when ideal theory manages to specify a feasible utopian outcome, it does so without telling us anything about how we might achieve such an ideal state, given, not least, our positions in deep historical injustice. This is why, Mills says, ideal theory can work as a form of ideology, right? It allows political theorists to present themselves as squarely concerned with remedying injustice, while also allowing them to do absolutely nothing about remedying it. Another way of putting this critique is to say, I think, that political philosophers are not insufficiently scientific, but insufficiently poetic. They need to think harder, that is, about how to body forth the forms of things unknown. Thank you.